attentive to it. So Kelly, I'll give the stage to you. Welcome.
All right, thank you for that great introduction, Ellen. Good morning, everyone. I'm joining you from your neighboring state over in Minnesota, where I am based. Ellen mentioned much of this already, but just to give you a sense of what Circle works on, we are based at an academic institution, and our work is solely at looking at civic engagement of youth. Today we'll be talking a lot about that in the context of voting, one of the ways that we can measure civic engagement in a really concrete way. But as I'll talk about later, we believe that civic engagement and creating the next generation of eligible voters must start far beyond, before people are actually eligible to vote. So we'll talk a little bit about that. But that also means that Circle's work extends to civic education and how we are preparing young people to become participants in our democracy. So I'll just start off right away by going through what we know about youth voter turnout from the last couple of election cycles. So as we know from the headlines from the last election, there was historic turnout in the 2020 election amongst all people, and that applied to young people as well. So according to our calculations, we saw that turnout of youth, and by youth we mean 18 to 29-year-olds, was 50% in 2020. So not just registered voters, but all young people who are eligible. This was a substantial increase in 2016, where turnout was kind of similar to previous presidential elections, maybe a bit lower. Youth turnout was only 39%. So we see that in general, we've had two historic elections now. And what the graph on the right here is showing is that youth are increasing their civic participation at higher rates than other voters. So turnout has been up across the board. So from comparable elections, that's represented by blue, the increase in turnout for all voters, but the turnout increases amongst youth have been higher. So historically, young people do participate at lower rates, but we're seeing them essentially close that gap, especially in these last two historic elections. So when we look at the trends over time, really that increase from 2014 to 2018 is very apparent here when you look at that graph on the right and that sharp increase in the red line down below, which shows turnout in midterm elections. So that's a very good sign, especially headed into another midterm election in 2022 that you all will be working on. But overall, since youth, since 18 to 21-year-olds have gotten the right to vote in 1972, we saw that also in 2020, we also saw similarly historic levels of civic participation. So our data allows us to look more granular than just at the country as a whole. So we can look state by state, and we'll also talk about how that looks when we break down young people based on other demographic characteristics, primarily race. So when we look state by state, we can see that turnout varied amongst youth and amongst all people, depending on where people live. So just looking at the darker purple states, we saw the highest youth turnout actually in New Jersey this last year. And we also saw very high turnout in Maine, Colorado, and Minnesota, which have strong trends of high participation. You will see that in this graph, Wisconsin is gray, and I'll talk about that on the next slide about what we know or don't know about youth turnout in Wisconsin. We also see here that traditionally swing states or battleground states in a presidential election will have very high turnout. These are places where there are many TV ads, there are very robust efforts to register and turn out voters, and that increased engagement generally leads to higher youth participation because it's just a higher salience election. People are walking young people through the process of registering and voting. However, what we saw in 2020 is that some of the highest turnout was correlated with states that sent ballots to everyone so that everyone could vote by mail. So all registered voters were proactively contacted, received a ballot, and were able to send that back. So we saw turnout in states like Washington and Oregon, which are not traditionally battleground states, but the civic participation amongst young people was very high there. Across the South, we generally see lower turnout. This is not just of youth, but of all people. That may be for a variety of reasons. They are not targeted states, as we just talked about. Their voting laws are not very expansive, and they're not very pro-voter. So we do see that we see lower turnout among across those southern states. Now, we don't really know that much about youth turnout in Wisconsin, and the reason is because when people fill out that registration card, that data all goes to a centralized state database. In that state database that many campaigns or nonprofits use to contact people, they do not provide information about age anymore. This is something that has been phased out in data that is no longer being provided. So what that means is that people who are coming on the voter file in the last 4 to 6 years, well, 0 to 6 years, we do not have birth date or age information about them. And that disproportionately impacts or creates kind of blind spots with young people who are most likely to be registering or re-registering as they're moving from one apartment to another. So we don't know exactly what youth turnout was. What we can say is that youth turnout does align with turnout of all voters also. There are a few exceptions, like you see here. New Jersey was the highest youth turnout state. They sent ballots to every single person. Here, the turnout of all voters was not quite as high, but Wisconsin has a strong civic tradition, and we can estimate that youth turnout was quite high. Maybe not as high as my state of Minnesota, but we can see that it may be comparable to some of these other higher turnout states. So that's kind of our best guess. So sorry that we are not able to provide that specific data. So let's talk a little bit about policies and how some of these policies might be helping young people vote, or what might be standing in the way of allowing young people to vote. We looked at, which now feels kind of like ancient history, H.R. 1, the For the People Act, was a piece of federal legislation that included a number of election reforms that were designed to make voting and registration easier for people. So we looked at states that have adopted a number of these policies already compared to states that have not adopted very many of them at all. And when we look at the states that have picked up kind of a cocktail of these policies, we see that voter turnout is higher amongst young people than states that don't have it. Now, we could also argue that civic culture in states with good election laws is more robust, and so that is also leading to voter turnout. But we are continuing to dig into this idea of what exactly can we do structurally to make it easier for young people to turn out, so it is not the constant having to register and turn out young people every single cycle. What are ways that we can really cement that? And what would be most helpful to pass at the state level to do that? Not included in H.R. 1 was vote by mail policies. So we also looked at the correlation between the types of vote by mail policies that were in place and also youth turnout. So the states, as I mentioned before, that sent ballots to every single registered voter saw a much higher youth turnout and a much higher increase in turnout over 2016. States that just send applications so that folks can request a vote by mail application, or even no excuse absentee, we saw less increases and less of an impact on the increases in youth turnout. So New Jersey, kind of our #1 youth turnout state, which will also be voting again on Tuesday, next Tuesday, implemented 2 policies. One which automatically registers people to vote through agencies like the Department of Motor Vehicles, and they sent ballots to every single person who was on their registration rolls in 2020. So that is two ingredients that we believe led to the successful youth turnout there in the last election. And we'll see how it carries over into 2021. So now stepping back, you all probably know a lot of this already, but I just wanted to touch on how important the youth vote is going to be. It was in 2020 and will continue to be. This is a graphic from our friends over at Catalyst, who provide much of this voter data that we use. And as we can see, the share of millennials and Gen Z is now about 1/3 of the electorate. Millennials are not in our definition of youth, millennials going all the way up to age about 40. But as you can see, kind of generations that we consider to be younger generations are no longer, they're not the majority yet, but they are a very sizable share of the electorate. So talking to young people cannot be an afterthought. Essentially, this needs to be a clear part of every organization and every campaign strategy for any electoral engagement that they're going to be doing. And of course, the youth electorate is amongst the most diverse. I was looking at some census data just on Minnesota yesterday, coming out of the 2020 census. And 1 out of every 4 people in the state of Minnesota now is a person of color. So again, this is not an afterthought. This needs to be a central part of any strategy that organizations are undertaking when thinking about how to engage people. I'm sure that census data looks very similar for Wisconsin as well. But young people are going to be more diverse racially than the population as a whole. So whereas our states might be majority of people of color in the next 20 or 30 years, amongst young people, that is going to be coming much sooner. So those younger generations, we need to be thinking about how are we able to more effectively communicate with a much more diverse audience that is our young people. When looking at turnout by race nationally, we do see, again, specifically of youth, we do see that white young people do tend to turn out at higher rates than young people of color. However, some very interesting trends here, looking at very high turnout amongst Latino and Asian Americans, which traditionally has lagged more substantially behind, but we actually see that their turnout was higher than that of young African American voters nationally. And if we look at those trends over time, it's a little bit hard to see here, but the point we're trying to make with this graph is that historically, the turnout between white and non-white youth was larger than it is now. We're starting to see instances in several elections. We saw a turnout of African American youth actually exceeded that of white youth. And we're seeing some of those gaps really begin to close. And if you look at the turnout of Asian American youth, slightly different numbers than this is from the census versus some of the data that we traditionally use. But we can see that some of those gaps are really closing. So again, thinking about how that diverse generation is changing their voting behaviors is an important part looking ahead. One interesting note, we broke out also the turnout by race by region. And as a fellow Midwesterner, one thing that was noteworthy to me is that the turnout gaps between white youth and youth of color are actually higher in places that are less diverse, places like the upper Midwest that are a bit slower to catch up in terms of some of the demographic trends that we're seeing in the West, Southwest, and even on some of the Eastern Coast states. So again, thinking about inclusive strategies so that we can close these gaps when they are a smaller share of the population. So thinking about what is leading or fueling some of these trends with the youth vote that we're seeing. So of course, we're coming off 2 historic elections, but we're also coming off of some unprecedented activism in the last couple of years, whether it's 2018 and seeing marches around the country that were led by youth demanding that ends to gun violence, or whether that was in the summer of 2020, when again, youth were in leadership with protests demanding racial justice and accountability following the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis. We see that not only were youth very involved, but they are doing something about it and feeling hopeful that their actions are leading to broader change. So in our surveys that Circle conducted prior to the 2020 election, for example, about 1 out of 4 youth attended a march or a demonstration in the 2020 election cycle. And about 1/4 of folks are registering their friends to vote, and half are trying to convince their friends to vote. So we're seeing young people are active, and young people are doing something about it, and they feel that their actions are leading to change. Of course, a lot of activity that is happening and a lot of the conversation that we're talking about is face-to-face, but it is also happening through digital media. So thinking about any strategies for reaching young people in 2022, digital engagement and activity on social media platforms is going to be critical. We also found that for youth of color, we see higher rates of engagement in creating and sharing online content with their friends in their peer networks. So especially for Latino and Black youth. So thinking about, again, not only ways to communicate to young people on digital mediums, but ways that they can be the voice and the messenger in order to communicate to their peer networks, because that is what is going to be most effective. So thinking about this broader framework, I just wanted to kind of plant a seed, and then we'll talk about some specific things to think about for 2022, but plant the seed around something we're calling growing voters. We've talked a lot about voting, elections, kind of campaign style outreach to young people, but there are a lot of strategies that are more broad than that can lead to more equitable civic engagement over time. And so this is the framework that we're talking about, and we'll have a big report coming out on this next year. And there are really a couple of different components of this to think about how a lot of different players who interact with young people on a day-to-day basis can increase civic participation. So one is in school environments in K-12 civic education. So whether that's strengthening K-12 civic education, supporting young people in the classrooms, we work with a number of states on developing standards for civics education and evaluating those programs. So that's one way that Circle in particular is thinking about how are we creating our next generation of civic actors. Second is the voting laws that we talked about. How do we create structures and systems that make voting easier? In Wisconsin, for example, you have election day registration. So we know that this is one voting law that has been studied, and Wisconsin has had election day registration for a long time, but we know that this makes voting easier for young people who will often move in September, 2 months before an election. So thinking about and working at the local or state level to pass some of these policies to make voting easier is another way that many folks can impact youth civic participation. Third, youth-centered election administration. So how can young people also be involved in the process of administering elections? Here in Minneapolis, where I'll be serving as an election judge next week, we have a student election judge program. So it actually allows high school students to come and serve in the polling place even before they become eligible to vote. So that allows them to see the system from the inside out and get that experience that they can communicate with their friends and their peers about and become experts on elections even before they're eligible to vote. And lastly, kind of going back to the piece I mentioned about digital, young people need to be the voice when communicating to young people. So when thinking about how the league is going to engage with youth in 2022, thinking about how can you have young people really leading any of those efforts, providing a lot of insight into what's the best way to reach folks, what social media platforms are they using, because that changes every couple of years, and what is the best way to be able to communicate the messages that the league might want to be getting out to folks. So just a few thoughts and then we'll open it up for questions here. So thinking about when reaching young people, one thing I didn't mention here is that if we want to create a more equitable and a more representative electorate amongst young people, we need to focus on populations right now that are voting at lower rates. So that does include youth of color, but this also includes youth that are not on college campuses. We see that college campus engagement is higher, or of young people on campus than those who are not on college campuses or might be doing other types of paths to education, whether that be through two-year institutions or kind of an extended program. So this is really what we would highlight as a critical gap. There is a lot of infrastructure on college campuses, a lot of institutionalizing of voter registration and voter engagement through programs like NSOLVE, which is a sister institution or a sister project of ours. I can't remember what the acronym stands for right now, but they just released a big report about how college campus registration and turnout is increasing over time. So finding young people that might not be on that path, might not already be involved in those institutions, is something that we would highlight as a critical gap for folks to fill in. And then thinking about on the longer term, of course, the league has been around for a very long time and has strong relationships and credibility with so many different institutions, whether that be other nonprofits or institutions in communities like schools. So thinking about, are there strategies to be able to do youth voter registration in high schools, which I know is something that the league has focused on in many places, but also thinking about how do we support kind of civic education and civic educators, especially in this current environment, and how can the league again think about making policy changes that is going to make civic engagement of young people, especially youth of color, but of all voters, easier and more fair. So that's all the material I came to present. I see a couple questions in the chat. So
Yeah.
we can open it up for not questions, but also discussion.
Absolutely. Kelly, thank you so much. I find your data, all this empirical evidence, really promising and encouraging in terms of civic life in the decades to come in particular, and it's pretty darn exciting right now. We do have a few questions already in the chat, and so let me go to the first one we had, and that was from Eloisa. Let me just find it. This is my computer is so sensitive. Okay, just a moment. Here's another question from Eloisa. Do you have elementary grade level curriculum on civic engagement that you could share with us?
I will confess that this is not my area of expertise at Circle, but I can talk about a couple of different things that Circle has done regarding civic education specific programs. So number one, I already mentioned that we do partner at the state level with to develop standards for civic education and then evaluate how students are doing regarding civic education. So we partner with the state of Massachusetts, and oh great, and someone else can speak about this, so that's great. And the state of Illinois on this. We also have a network of teachers and have relationships with civic educators and provide them resources to be able to talk about equitable civic education in the classroom, and also train fellow educators on this. So that is a program where we have done like a micro-credentialing program that has specifically been done through that network of civic educators. And then the last is we just have a larger network called TFDA, Teaching for the Democracy Alliance. So we have a network where peers can share resources and materials for those who are wanting to move civic education curriculum or look for resources there. And we should hear from Kate and see what.
Yeah, Kate Ullman, you mentioned you can speak to civics education. Why don't you just please unmute yourself and join and share your comments.
Hi, thank you so much for your presentation. I really appreciate it. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. I'm on my phones. I am a former high school civics teacher, and I work at Northland College in the teacher education program, and I'm part of the Ashland Bayfield League chapter. And I've been a part of a group that is working with iCivics to promote civics education nationwide and specifically in Wisconsin. So specifically about civics education resources, iCivics is a really great resource for civics education curriculum at the K-12 level. And that's a nonprofit started by Sandra Day O'Connor. And then the presenter just mentioned so collaboration with Illinois, and Illinois has a really robust civics education program, primarily at the middle and high school level is their focus. But if you Google Illinois civics, you'll find a lot of really great curriculum resources online for teachers. So that's just a few things. In Wisconsin specific, Wisconsin I has some curriculum resources for educators. That's like C-SPAN for Wisconsin, you know, and so they have a lot of video-based resources related to civics education as well. And so the last thing is that recently this year, a new framework was released nationally called the Educating for American Democracy. And EAD is the acronym, and that's a collaboration that Circle probably was a part of, I imagine, doing work nationally on civics education and creating some new recommendations. So there's a lot out there. I'll put my email in the chat if anyone wants to contact me directly.
That'd be great.
But I also just wanted to say that this year I've been working with iCivics and some other teachers and social studies educators in the state to launch a new organization called the Wisconsin Civic Learning Coalition. And what we're doing is trying to organize in Wisconsin to support civics education, support teachers and K-12 civics curriculum, specifically a requirement for high school civics for graduation, because Wisconsin's one of only 7 states that does not require civics for high school graduation. So I'd love anyone who wants to reach out to me to talk about supporting civics teachers in this current political climate, or supporting civics education in the state more broadly. And I'll put my email in the chat. Thanks.
Yeah, well, thank you for joining the conversation. Those are very key resources. And Dorothy, you had put a question in the chat wondering about some more specifics on curriculum. Do you feel like your question was answered from Kelly and our newest speaker, Kate?
Spectacularly answered, especially since I find out that she's a member of the neighbor league.
Oh my God, that's great.
Her email and
Yeah,
we can work with that. Thank you, Kelly.
And Eloisa, you also mentioned a question about does Kelly have elementary grade level curriculum on civic engagement? And it sounds like maybe Kate may have provided you with good answers on that too, unless the two of you would like to add to that. Do you feel like, Eloisa, that was good information for you?
Hi, yeah, I thank you so much. I really appreciate both Kelly and Kate's comments. We're going to start a civic engagement project with 3rd graders on Milwaukee South Side with largely Latino and multicultural students. And we've started from scratch. So now we can zoom forward with knowing there are these resources available, and it would be through the League of Women Voters of Milwaukee County. And We hadn't thought about the training aspect of other teachers. We're thinking about it being volunteers. So anyway, we'll follow up with both of you later, and thank you so much.
And just to let everybody know, Eloisa is active in our Community Alliance Committee, the State League, and she is very active in the DEIJ space. That's diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice space within the league. Thank you, Eloisa.
Yeah. And Judy has put a question in the chat. She said recently the Ripon Area League hosted Amy Anderson, Executive Director of the Center for Youth Voice, which apparently is a successful program in Minnesota. The YMCA, the league, and other partners have created a strong program to educate youth on voting, how state legislatures and the UN work via actual youth participation and mock weekend events. So her question is, if I can get my chat to calm down here, has this program, I cannot believe how sensitive my pad is, has this program added to success in engaging youth in Minnesota?
Well, 2 comments. I think, in general, if we're talking about engagement and measures of success being voter turnout, I think Minnesota has a strong culture. I don't know much about how the civic education requirements and standards here. But we do have kind of a legacy of strong civic participation. And again, Kate probably knows more about this than I do, but some of the recommendations in the civic education space include, more participatory learning in civic education. So not maybe some of the education that I received, for example, where you learn a lot about kind of memorizing the 3 branches of government and other things like that, but also participatory activities. And so it does seem like these types of programs would be consistent with teaching young people deliberative skills and diplomacy skills that are some of the important recommendations coming out of the findings.
Okay. Lisa also earlier asked, there's a correlation of age information by geographic areas in Wisconsin. Have you examined this correlation to get a sense of youth or younger voter turnout?
Can you tell me more about what you mean by that?
Yes, we'd be
the rural urban question.
Sure, be glad to. Yes, Wisconsin, we are age placed in Wisconsin. For example, more rural Wisconsin, more northern Wisconsin, you have an older population, and in more urban settings, a younger population. So there could be you had said that Wisconsin didn't have the age-based information by voters, voter turnout or registered voters. And but I think if you look at our state geographically, you do have a sense of the age of the generally of the voting population just by geographic areas. I don't know if that was helpful or not.
No, I get what you're saying. And of course, we can also look at places where we know there's a high. I didn't have time to pull the data together on this before this call, but of course we could look at campus precincts too and see, okay, how is voter turnout around UW-Madison, in kind of the Green Bay and some of the schools, Oshkosh area, any of the UW schools, and see how voter turnout is tracking over time in those specific districts or specific precincts where young people are going to live. We do see that urban voters actually turn out, urban youth do turn out at slightly higher rates than rural youth also across the country. So I would guess that that is no different in Wisconsin, just kind of given kind of how our population is changing and more folks kind of living in cities and being more engaged potentially than folks in rural areas, just having more kind of opportunities for organizing and activism. So there could be other ways, I think, to examine the youth turnout piece, looking at the geography level, like you mentioned, and that might be a way to kind of fill in some of the gap of knowledge.
Perfect. I have actually a question for the audience based on all the content that you've shared, especially regarding, where youth were in 2020, the levels of their political engagement, being extraordinary, 1 in 4 having attended a rally. I mean, these are very awake people. They're not the lazy youth that are stereotyped so often and frequently. I would like to ask those in the audience who might be young voters themselves, maybe in that age range of 18 to 29 or so. Is what Kelly shared, does it compare with your experience as a young voter and what you've seen around you in your circle of friendships and in school, if you're still in school, but of voting age? So anyone in the audience, you can unmute yourself and share what you would like to share.
I can share a little bit. So I just graduated from UW-Madison, and I think, anytime any of my friends or anyone wouldn't vote, I'd say 98% of the time it's because, when you're moving every single year or you're not a Wisconsin resident, it's just such a hassle. There is an option to get a student voter ID, but that in and of itself is a bit of a process. So, I mean, really just kind of the extra barrier of having to update your information every year, or maybe you're registered in your home state and then, everyone's busy. And it's if you just have to put in those extra 2-3 steps, it can really easily kind of turn people away.
Wow, that's really a good observation. We've all just received a notice on our screens that the breakout session is going to close in 28 seconds. And then believe me, you're just going to be booted out. So I want to thank Kelly for joining us with this key research. And I look forward to reading your reports that you referenced. We can only learn more from doing that. And I think that we've definitely linked into what we can do forward. To all of you out there who have attended, thank you. You're going to be automatically returned to the main room.